What's going on, YouTube? It's been a while since I've uploaded an in-depth breakdown of one of my clone builds, so today's video will cover a highly requested service rifle, the Mark 12 SPR. As with most clone rifles, this will be very detail intensive, so sit back and get your notepads ready because this will essentially be a history lesson as well as a tutorial for building a faithful replica of this prolific rifle. Before we begin, I'd like to thank @based_firearms on Instagram for lending me the Mark 12 build that you see on top, so that I may compare it and contrast it with mine, which is on the bottom. Lastly, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and give me a follow on Instagram @inferior_rifles for more information. While I've talked about the Mark 12 program in previous videos, as well as showing the assembly process for a Mark 12 build, I have yet to explain the history and the different variants of this classic GWAT icon. Despite making appearances in hit movies such as Lone Survivor and American Sniper, and thereafter becoming one of the most popular service rifles among enthusiasts, I've been waiting to film a video on this platform until I had the chance to build one for my personal collection. Or more accurately, to rebuild one for my collection. The truth is, the first service rifle that I ever properly cloned was the Mark 12 Mod 1, which I foolishly sold in order to build another version of the Mark 12. This cycle repeated a few more times until, ironically, I ended up back where I started, with the Mark 12 Mod 1. This definitely wasn't the most efficient way to figure out which version was my favorite, but seeing as how I've owned every iteration of the rifle in some form over the past decade, I thought that I might be able to shed some light on which one might be right for you. Getting into it, the SPR concept owes its lineage to earlier rifles used within the Army and Navy Special Forces groups, who would accurize their standard issue M4 carbines using free-floated handguards, magnified optics, and match-grade ammunition. In this case, the Mark 262 from Black Hills Ammunition was developed alongside the Mark 12, which greatly contributed to the program's success after gaining a reputation as a fast and highly accurate 77 grain cartridge. The concept of a precision-capable weapon system that spans the gap between a standard-issue carbine and a sniper rifle was not new during the Mark 12's development. In fact, there were other similar parallel programs developed around the same time period as the Mark 12, such as the SEAL Recce program, the Marine Corps' SAM-R program, and the Army's SDMR program, not to be confused with the more recent M110A1 program, which shares the same name. Though all of these other rifles were fielded in some capacity, it's worth mentioning that the Mark 12 was the most widely used by far since it became a staple across many groups within US SOCOM. Development of the Mark 12 began around 1999 and resulted in somewhere around 150 upper receivers known as early SPRs, or Special Purpose Receivers, as these were originally intended to be issued as a standalone upper receiver in the same fashion as the CQBR, or Close Quarters Battle Receiver. Though the first rifles outfitted with these uppers are commonly referred to as early Mark 12 Mod Zeros, this designation actually didn't come later until Crane began delivering complete weapon systems with dedicated lowers. The earliest upper receivers were equipped with an older generation PRI carbon fiber handguard, barrel nut, and front sight base, which makes them a little bit more difficult to clone compared to the so-called late Mod Zeros. Early uppers were commonly paired with an older selection of Leupold rifle scopes, while late Mod Zeros onwards heavily utilized Leupold's Mark IV series of optics. Unfortunately, I don't have an example of a Mod Zero to show you today, but it is worth mentioning that the Mod Zero was used almost exclusively by Army Special Forces, while the Mod 1 rifles, like the ones I have here, were fielded extensively by the Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, as well as the US Marine Corps. After Crane delivered a number of Mark 12 Mod Zeros for US SOCOM, Knight's Armament Company was approached as a potential second supplier for certain components, namely the handguard, which was previously supplied by PRI. This solicitation resulted in a new version of the Mark 12 dubbed the Mark 12 Mod 1. These rifles were outfitted with a Knight's Armament long free-float RAS handguard and lacked the swan sleeve on the upper rail present on the Mod Zero. This change also necessitated the switch from ARMS No. 22 medium scope rings to ARMS No. 22 high scope rings. The decision was also made to forego the PRI front sight gas block combo, instead replacing it with a low-profile gas block. And, side note, if you're wondering why the Mark 12 Mod 1 has an exposed gas block rather than using a longer handguard in order to protect the gas block, which is seen on most modern rifles, it's simply because 12 inches was the longest handguard length that was available for most manufacturers at the time, Knight's Armament included. Despite this, end users didn't seem to have issues concerning the exposed gas block, and these changes ultimately resulted in a rifle that was both lighter and slightly more durable than its predecessor. There was also a lesser-known third variant of the Mark 12, nicknamed the Mod Holland, or Mod H for short, Named after the individual credited with developing the Mod H, Master Sergeant Steve Holland, these rifles were designed with a similar mindset to the original Seal Recce rifles, favoring a shorter 16-inch barrel with handling characteristics more akin to a standard carbine. Unlike the Seal Recce and the new Mark 12 Mod 1 rifles, the Mod H rejected the Knights Armament quad rail, choosing to stick with the PRI carbon fiber handguard from the Mod 0, though some Knights Armament URX-4 M-Lock handguards have also been seen on use on select Mod H's. The Mod Holland was largely used by 5th Group Army Special Forces and has been spotted in active service surprisingly late into the global war on terror. So with the history lesson out of the way, let's talk about what parts you'll need to build a Mark 12. While I chose to build a Mod 1, I'll be sure to cover any differences between the variants as we move from the front to the back of the rifle. Starting with the suppressor, every version of the Mark 12 utilizes the same OpSync 12th model suppressor, now marketed as the AEM5 from Allen Engineering. The AEM5, or OpSync 12th model, is a reflex-style suppressor, meaning that it overlaps with the forwardmost portion of the rifle barrel in order to gain more internal volume while adding less overall length to the rifle. This suppressor also uniquely indexes off of a tapered collar, which ensures that the suppressor will not loosen during use, and will also not cause a point of impact shift when the suppressor is removed and then reinstalled. It's worth mentioning that this collar is necessary to mount an AEM5, and therefore you will need an SPR profile barrel for your build, since it has an additional shoulder for the collar to rest on. The muzzle brake, which the suppressor threads onto, is the AEMB, or Allen Engineering muzzle brake, and is one of the few suppressor mounts actually designed to use a crush washer rather than shims, due to the collar being responsible for maintaining alignment of the suppressor rather than the muzzle device itself. The specific barrel used on the Mark 12 Mod 0 and Mod 1 was most commonly made in-house at Crane using an 18-inch Douglas blank and utilized a 1 in 7 twist with a rifle-length gas system. The Mark 12 Mod H originally used a Noveske-made 16-inch SPR profile barrel with a mid-length gas system, which was eventually phased out for one spun in-house by Crane, which was also possibly made from a Douglas blank. A recurring theme you'll see with the Mark 12 Mod H is that there is less info on it out there compared to the Mark 12 Mod 1 and Mod 0. It's worth mentioning that there are several commercially available SPR profile barrels both in 16 and 18-inch lengths, including ones from PRI, Ballistic Advantage, White Oak Armament, and Compass Lake Engineering, just to name a few. But the barrels made by Kevin at High Caliber Sales are the most correct in my opinion, since he coats his barrels with the same dark gray finish from KG Gun Coat as was used on the original Mark 12 barrels that were used when he worked at Crane. Moving back to the gas blocks for the Mark 12 are fairly straightforward. The Mod 0 used the early or late generation PRI front sight gas block combo, depending on whether you're building an early or late variant, while the Mod 1 and Mod Holland used a low-profile Mark 12 gas block. In this case, there are also several manufacturers who make a commercial Mark 12 gas block, such as Daniel Defense, Badger Ordnance, and Knights Armament themselves, though I have chosen to use a surplus gas block manufactured by Coronet, who began supplying them for US SOCOM around 2008. Moving on to the handguard, I've already talked about the handguard itself, so I'll keep this part brief, other than to say that the Knights Armament long free float RAS used on the Mod 1 goes by a few different names. Some rails are marked M4 Match Free Float RAS, while others are marked M4 Sniper RAS, but the most common by far is marked SR15/16 Free Float RAS, just like mine. All versions of this rail are identical, but that doesn't stop cloners from overpaying for the versions bearing more rare markings. The long free float RAS also seemingly bears different part numbers depending on which markings you have and whether it was packaged as a full kit with rail panels or as a standalone rail. Regardless of these markings and or the part numbers, all versions of the long free float RAS are considered clone correct for a Mod 1 build. Next we'll move on to accessories mounted to the Mark 12's abundance of 1913 rails, starting with the iron sights. The sights issued with the Mark 12 Mod 0 were the aforementioned PRI front sight gas block, as well as an ARMS number 40 rear sight. Mod 1s were almost exclusively seen with a set of flip-up iron sights from Knights Armament, most notably the large knob 600-meter rear sight and the product code 99051 front sight in black. Mod H's notoriously lacked iron sights of any kind on most rifles for one reason or another. Moving on to bipods, these mainly fell into two categories, with very early SPRs using an antiquated Versa pod, and pretty much every other Mark 12 variant afterwards using some form of a Harris bipod. These could either be the 6 to 9 or 9 to 13 inch models, and would use a variety of mounts, including but not limited to the standard Picatinny Harris mount, as well as the Knights Armament MWS mount and even the Arms No. 32 throw lever mount, among others. Most Mark 12s were issued with an Eagle TAS-1 sling with a KAC swivel mount and hardware made by Uncle Mike's. The last accessory commonly seen mounted to the Mark 12's handguard would be the laser, most commonly an Insight PEC-2A, though later rifles were often seen paired with PEC-15s, LA-5s, and even PEC-16s in the Marine Corps' case. Moving on to the receiver set, Mark 12 rifles were built from a mix of Colt and Dymaco parts that were readily available to Crane at the time. After the special purpose receiver became a complete rifle by means of a dedicated lower, the Mark 12's upper was most commonly paired with an M16A1 profile lower receiver. There are exceptions to this, of course, with some uppers being mated to either M4A1 or even M16A2 receivers, though less commonly. The bolt carrier is a standard M16 BCG capable of cycling on full auto, though full auto use was discouraged due to the Mark 12's stainless steel barrel lacking a chrome lining and not being well suited for anything but semi-auto fire. The charging handle on all variants of the Mark 12 was a PRI gasbuster charging handle, which is designed to shield the shooter's face from excess gases produced when shooting suppressed and has an enlarged latch. Lastly, for the receiver sets, the Mark 12 was originally spec'd with a Knights Armament 2-stage trigger, which was eventually phased out for the Geisley Super Select fire trigger, either of which was a substantial improvement over a mil-spec fire control group and further lent to the accuracy of this platform. Moving to the rear of the rifle, there were a few different stocks used on the Mark 12, with Crane favoring the fixed M16A1 stock on the majority of rifles. There were also instances of longer M16A2 fixed stocks being used on the Mark 12, as well as collapsing SOP-mod stocks, many of which were either installed by a unit-level armorer or were the result of using an M4A1 lower receiver. It's worth mentioning that using a carbine buffer assembly with a rifle-length gas system like on the Mark 12 Mod 1 or Mod 0 usually resulted in bolt bounce on full auto, though given the Mark 12's role as a designated marksman rifle, this was seemingly a non-issue. The Mark 12 Mod H, which didn't have this issue due to its mid-length gas system, uniquely used the Ace Gen 1 SOP mod stock as well as a litany of other collapsing stocks installed by the end user. I'll finish up by talking about optics. The Mark 12 Mod 0 was most commonly seen using scopes borrowed from the M24 sniper rifle, namely the Leupold Very X and the Leupold Mark IV, both of which were 3.5 to 10 by 40 rifle scopes. Later Mod Zeros, as well as the Mark 12 Mod 1, were mostly seen paired with more compact Leupold Mark IV 3 to 9 by 36 rifle scopes, and later Navy Mark 12s utilized the Night Force 2.5 to 10 by 24 NXS. Even the commercial versions of these scopes can be tricky to track down, though the truly correct optics for the Mod 1 can be even more expensive and more difficult to obtain, as the correct Night Force scope would be the very rare NavSpec model, while the correct Leupold optics would feature an older blended-style illumination housing rather than the new square housing. The correct Leupold scope would also feature M2 turrets with a bullet drop compensator calibrated specifically for the Mark 12's 18-inch barrel using Mark 262 ammunition. There's also a variant of the Mark IV scope, which is a 2.5 to 8 by 36, known as the TS30A2, which is commonly touted as a correct optic for the Mark 12, but in reality these were never actually issued during the Mark 12's time in service and are actually correct for newer DMRs like the Marine Corps' M38. That being said, newer versions of the scope, such as the TS30A2, are generally accepted as a good stand-in for the correct optic given their rare nature. The Mod Holland used a mix of scopes common to both the Mod 0 and the Mod 1, as well as more modern scopes later in its service life. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the Arms No. 22 throw-lever scope rings were included with the majority of Mark 12 deployment kits, though other mounts, such as the Night Force A110 ultralight rings, were also used. And I'll finish by saying, as with most weapons used by US SOCOM, there are a variety of optics and accessories employed by end users for each Mark 12 variant, meaning that cloners have a wide selection of one-off configurations that they can choose to clone as well. Hopefully this video comes in handy for those of you wishing to build your own Mark 12, and even if you're not planning on building one, I hope you found it interesting anyway. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks.